Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Victoria Volk. She is a self published author, grief recovery specialist, creator, and podcast host of Grieving Voices. Welcome to the show, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
You are welcome to the show, Victoria. You are welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk about. We'll be talking about moving beyond grief. So, Victoria, I want to understand first for the audience who is Victoria. I told about you being an author, about a grief recovery specialist, but I'm sure that is not just about you. There's much more beyond that. So, tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, your journey, so that the audience understands about you directly from you.
Yeah, so I've been a lifelong griever, I would say. My father died when I was a child of cancer. My mother's mother passed away the year before that. So my mother was essentially a grieving daughter and widow for most of my upbringing because I was, would have been maybe seven, not 6 or 7 when my grandmother passed away, when her mom passed away. And so there was a lot of trauma then that happened to me after my father had passed away. And so I grew up thinking or believing that my life was just really one of suffering. And, but there really wasn't a lot of conversation about grief, um, or, because I was a child, people think that I just didn't understand. And so there wasn't an open dialogue with me about my feelings or about how I was doing or anything like that. So I grew up pretty much stuffing my emotions, and which most people do, a lot of people do, because there just wasn't this open dialogue. And that followed me into my young adulthood, and started to have an issue with alcohol. Um, I was a good kid in high school. Like throughout high school, I didn't party a whole lot and things like that. But in my young adulthood, I kind of made up for that. So um, my life was kind of going in a downward spiral in my early 20s, and we say in grief recovery that adulthood is childhood reenactments. And I think that's very true. And it's been very true for a lot of grievers that I've personally worked with. But grief aside, I'm also a mother of 3 teenagers, a college kid, and a wife of a little over 20 years. So I'm also a veteran. So my background is quite eclectic, and I've held a lot of different positions. Just I'm never afraid to try something new. Put it that way. So that's always been my motto, is to try it once, and if I enjoy it, great, and if I don't, I'll move on. so so that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very much you, and you have seen life from very close. You have seen things from very close, understood it, and now you are, living the life that you wanted or designed for yourself. So I want to understand, since you know about grief quite closely, how should people look at grief? What is this grief? What is the difference between grief and sorrow? And how long does this grieving last? Help us understand.
Well, I think the first place to start is the definition of grief, because it's not just the death of someone, right? Grief is the loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations. It's anything that you wish would have been or would be or could be different, better, or more. And so if we think about that definition alone, think about the career that you lost, your loss of health, a relationship, a friendship that fell away. I mean, so often it's our friendships that are so impactful on our lives. And we can lose friendships, especially as grievers. If you're like if you lose a spouse or a significant other, I've heard so often that friendships fall away as a often as time passes as a result because people don't show up for you in the way that you expect, right? So there's that loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations. And I think what grief does too, especially if you lose someone very close to you, is it puts a mirror to your face of you have to look at yourself like, who am I now without this person in my life? Or what do I do now with this? And often when you have a loss, it brings up all the losses you had before that because grief is cumulative and it's cumulatively negative. And so if unless we're allowing our bodies to move through the emotions of grief, and you ask what's the difference between grief and sorrow, I think it's very much intertwined. I think you can feel sorrowful, right? You can feel sorrowful over the loss of a loved one or the loss of a dream. But if it's if you're finding yourself feeling that sorrow for 20 plus years, like in my case, it was over 30 years, that's an indicator for you that you're not working on your grief. You're not allowing yourself to feel and you're not working in letting your body process your emotions. We can either be a processing plant or we can be a holding tank for all of this stuff. And it's just toxic in our bodies.
Right, right, Victoria. So let me understand it in a different manner. In When people lose someone, they die, they pass away for whatever reasons, then what is the difference between grieving and mourning? You mourn someone, there is a time period for it or a bit longer. Why does grief last beyond that? Is it because your life was so dependent on them that you feel that loss? Or is it your expectations that could have been or could have happened? Because those who actually love or are very close, they also know the fact that this is a very mortal sort of an existence, and one day, so and your real memories, your feelings actually outlive all of this. Help us understand then why does a mourning has a particular period, that this is the time and it will be you will come out of it, not that you have forgotten the person, but there is life to catch up on, and grieving still lasts for long period. I want to understand that nuance or the difference, or maybe the similarity from you.
I think it's all of those things, actually. But one of the myths of grief is that time heals all wounds, and time doesn't heal. It's the action you take within time that moves you towards healing. And so if people are stuck, when let's say you have a first anniversary coming around, the first year is often the hardest, right? But a lot of grievers will say it gets easier with time. Well, what makes it get easier with time? Well, there's a separation, right, from the event or from when that loss occurred to where you are now, of course, but what have you done in that time? What actions has that person taken in that time that they feel better? That's the difference. And so when you have people though that say, but you can also have people who are completely emotionally bypassing their sorrow, their grief, stuffing it down and doing what most people do is grieving alone, trying to replace the loss, keeping busy. These are more myths of grief, by the way, doing all of these other things, and possibly at the same time, resorting to other behaviors in order to feel better, such as alcohol, drugs, relationships, pornography, shopping. There's these behaviors that we resort to feel better. Even exercise can be used to the extreme to feel better. We call them STIRBs, short-term energy relieving behaviors. And so if your grief is going to come up, it's going to manifest. And either it's going to manifest as physical symptoms where you can have migraines, think of yourself as like a tea kettle. if you are not letting that steam come out, it's just going to keep on simmering, right? It's going to keep on until it bursts, right? Until it just something has to happen. Like your grief is gonna manifest. These are, like I said, either as physical symptoms or um, you're gonna resort to these behaviors, and maybe even both, to feel better. And so it's not a matter of why does it last longer for some people. It's because we don't know the nuances of the person who, let's say you're looking at somebody else and thinking, gosh, they've got it. So they're put together. They lost their significant other. Why am I having such a hard time? You don't know the nuances of that relationship. You don't know what they're doing behind closed doors. You simply don't know. But we make up these stories in our minds because of our own beliefs, right? We have our own beliefs about grief. We have our own patterning of behavior. We have these, each person grows up with a belief about grief based on their childhoods. How do you deal with it? And by the age 3, we've learned 75% of how we're going to respond to life. The remaining becomes by age 15. So from a very young age, we are like antennas. And we're taking and processing all the information of people around us of, oh, when this happens, this is what they do. When someone dies, oh, we don't talk about it. A little child can say, 5-year-old little girl, like myself, or 6-year-old, oh, I'm not going to speak about grandma because when I do, my mom cries. I don't want to upset her. So I'm not going to talk about my feelings because it upsets my mom. These are the things we learn as young children.
Right, right, Victoria. So, what is the ideal way? Because we cannot stop loss in life. So, what is the ideal way to actually grieve so that you can know there is a life beyond that? How would you like to say? Just you talked about some child not crying because the mother will get upset. The mother is more worried about the child. Everyone is worried about everything else, and then nobody understands actually how the right has to be done. Is there a right way or an ideal way to look at the loss of love, life, or relationship?
Well, let me just highlight this too, that it can be less than loving relationships that cause grief too. You can have a really tumultuous relationship with a parent or with a significant other, and they pass away, and you feel anger and you feel sadness. It's a both and, right? Like you can feel all the things. And I think it's that emotional incompleteness is what keeps us stuck in our grief. Because what happens when someone dies? It's like, oh, I wish I would have said this. I wish I would have done that. I wish. I shoulda, and then all of these things flood into our memories of the past, of the good times, of things you wish you would have done with this person or said to this person. What do you do with that? That's what keeps us stuck, is the emotional incompleteness. And so to move beyond grief and to move forward from grief, live alongside it, where you can have a memory and it not take you to the pain of the past, where an anniversary can come around of the person who, maybe it's their birthday, maybe it's the anniversary, maybe it's their deathversary, right? And you can have a lot of people can have a really difficult day on those days. And it can pull them back to the pain of the past, right back to that moment, or right back to the argument they had, or right back to some moment in the past, right? What do you do with that? You have to allow yourself to move through the emotional incompleteness. Well, how do you do that? That's when I discovered the grief recovery method, and that's what changed my life. And that's the method that I am a huge proponent of. It's the one thing that worked for me when I tried therapy. And you can try, it might take a dozen therapists. And not everybody wants to do talk therapy, right? Because you don't want to sit in someone's chair for 3 years in an office and feeling like you're not getting anywhere. Support groups can be great for connection and connecting with other people with similar losses. But if you're just hearing the same stories over and over and over and other people's stories and talking about your story, you're not taking action. So it's this ruminating, it's this repetition that keeps you stuck. It's not moving you forward. So grief recovery method is what I recommend for grievers. And it's not a one size fits all. Yes, it's one method that I promise you will work for you or anybody. It can work for you because it's about you and your grief story and you alone. You're applying the method to your grief. And that's why it works for anybody.
Right. And what's the method, Victoria?
It is a series of steps or actions that you take to become emotionally complete. And it's a very holistic way of doing it. It's not easy work. It can be very emotional, but the people that I've worked with have said to me after they've completed it, like, you look at where you are when you start and then where they come to the end. It's not just a way to process your grief, but it's also a learning and educational program where you learn about grief in a way that you never have and were never taught as a child, where you have a greater understanding of why you do the things you do, of how normal and natural grief really is. But we've become so desensitized to it. We don't even want to talk about grief. We don't want to talk about death. We are a death adverse people. We've separated ourselves so much from the dying process, and it just helps you it first of all challenges your beliefs around all of those things that you grew up with. It brings in new knowledge. And what do you do with new knowledge? It helps you change your behaviors. And I think it helps you have more compassion and understanding for probably the people who hurt you in your life.
Right, right, Victoria. So, is it possible from moving from grief, from surviving to thriving? People generally don't get to see that part or understand that part when they are grieving, especially when they are a bit more deep into it.
For me, I thought for many years that I was destined to just suffer. I didn't think that feeling any other way was possible. I had been molested as a child. All I knew was grief. I had traumatic experiences in my young adulthood. All I knew was trauma and suffering. And I didn't know that there was anything that could help me. And you have to be open and you have to be ready. And that's the only way, is being open and being ready.
Right, right, Victoria. There is much to understand from you and learn from you. And this is just one podcast episode. You have yourself a podcast from which a lot of people can learn. Grieving Voices, that's the name of your podcast. You are the host of it. Tell us a bit about that so that people can learn about all these things directly from you.
Yeah, so the first 10 episodes or so are actually educational. So if you want to learn more about what we talk about in grief recovery, that's a great place to start. But I bring in people from all walks of life. Stories of all kinds of grief are brought into the podcast. It was started really so people could share their grieving voices, right? Give people a platform to share. And we really go deep into the story. I never rush the interviews. I feel like when it comes to grief, you can't rush that conversation, but we go really deep, really fast, actually. And I think it's through the podcast where people can understand that, oh, well, that's grief too. Oh, that's grief too. Like, having to move out of my own neighborhood, because I took a new job, like, oh, now I'm not seeing the same postmaster every day or the UPS guy or the same delivery person or my neighbors who I lived next to for 15 years. And so there's all these little grief experiences that stack up, these little things that add richness to our life. The relationships are the people that add richness to our life. And when they're no longer there, it's there's grief. It's like, what do you do with that? And so we don't think about all these things, and it all collectively stacks up. But so does healing. So all the things that you can do to move forward, meditation, journaling, giving your grief a voice, um, creative art, like exhibiting your feelings through art, or there's so many things that we can do, these little action steps that are also cumulative, but are cumulatively beneficial. And that can be supportive as you are working through your grief.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have written a book also. Can you tell us a bit about the book? Is it also on grief or is it something else?
It's actually a more personal story of my grief, and but it's kind of where I was at the time. It was before I found grief recovery, actually. And so there are some things in there I wish I could change, right? Because I have new knowledge. I gained new knowledge after writing the book. But yeah, it was kind of where I was at the time. And actually, when it was in the editing phase, I had another grief experience where you can read it in the book, but I reconnected with my father's brother, his last living brother, who was very close to him. But when my father passed away, I actually didn't have a relationship anymore with my father's family. So in one fell swoop, I lost uncles, cousins, grandparents, everything. They were no longer in our lives. And that was because of the adults, right? I was a child, but that was because of the adults. And so now, an adult, I reconnected with my uncle when I found out he had brain cancer. And so, in a 6-month period, I reconnected with him, and it was a very healing experience, I think, for both of us. I felt this pull to go see him in the hospital, not knowing if he would even remember me, recognize me, want me there. And it was it was life changing, really. It was, and I feel like, maybe the spirit of my father, I don't know. I don't know. I just felt this pull to go see my uncle, and it was the best thing I could have done for myself, and I think for him as well. But yeah, so that's kind of touched on in the book too. But yeah, it's where I was at the time. I would write a very different book today because I am in a very different place today.
Amidst all those grief that you saw from early on till understanding your uncle, understanding perhaps your dad better through
Mhm.
your uncle, does it look to be a very difficult life or does it look to be a very beautiful life? What would you say of your experience?
Oh, I feel like I have really, I might start crying. I feel like we can feel gratitude to the depths that we feel the most whole or like ourselves. I feel like maybe the most whole within ourselves. And I feel the most whole within myself today than I ever have. Um, because I'm doing things with my life that are in alignment with who I am. I'm deeply compassionate. Empathy is my number one strength. And so everything that I have accomplished or I've done has only been after I went through grief recovery in 2019. The podcast, working with grievers, doing energy healing work, getting these bunch of certifications, like it's all been in service and only after I worked through my own stuff because I could not be of service to others until I myself felt whole.
Absolutely. There is much to learn from you, much to understand about life, much to understand about grief. So, for those people who want to understand your story more, to want to get your help in grief recovery, to get through to your podcast, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
My website is probably the best, theunleashedheart.com. And I have links to all the things on there. I have some free ebooks, which I have some technical difficulties right now I'm working through, but for some reason those links are not working. But I do have ebooks on there that are free. There's a pet loss ebook now on there too, which is new. And postpartum, there's a few different, types of grief that is touched on in those ebooks. Yeah, the podcast is obviously free. Grieving Voices, there's a link to that on there. Yeah, and I have a biweekly newsletter that I send out that is more of a little love note for me every 2 weeks. And I get a little bit more personal in there. So yeah, lots of free resources there.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.